She stood at the gate in white gloves and a pillbox hat, checking her seams before her name was called. Boarding a plane once meant dressing like you mattered. In the years after the war, a commercial flight was not a commute. It was an event, closer to opening night at the theater than to catching a bus. The people who flew were a small, self-selected slice of the country, and they carried themselves accordingly. Nobody had to teach a woman how to dress for the airport. She already knew, because she dressed that way for church, for downtown, for anywhere she expected to be seen. Here is the number that explains everything else in this video. A round-trip ticket across the country could run $300 to $500 in an era when the average family lived on a little over $5,000 a year. That is not a splurge. That is close to a month of a household's entire income spent on a single seat. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it. If you could afford to be at that gate, you dressed like it, because everyone around you had done the exact same math and reached the exact same conclusion. Flying was not for everyone yet. It was for the people who already lived formal, public-facing lives, and the airport simply asked them to keep being themselves. Most Americans in 1960 had never once set foot on a commercial airliner. Flying was still a minority experience, closer to a milestone than a habit. That scarcity is the real engine behind the elegance people remember. When something is rare and expensive, the people who get to do it treat it with respect, and they dress to match the moment. Families would drive to the airport on a Sunday afternoon for no reason except to watch. They dressed the children in their good clothes and stood on an observation deck just to see a plane lift off the ground. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works on anyone who has ever felt a plane rumble beneath their feet for the first time. October of 1958 is the month everything started to change, though nobody in the terminal that day could have known it yet. Pan American World Airways put the Boeing 707 into service on its transatlantic route, and the jet age had officially arrived. Flights got faster. They did not, however, get cheaper. Not for another 20 years. The glamour only intensified. Pan Am is the name people picture when they picture this whole era, and for good reason. Its stewardesses were required to be poised, often multilingual, and held to a standard of presentation that made the uniform itself a kind of promise to the passenger. The airline was not just selling a seat. It was selling an idea of what a modern, sophisticated life looked like. Trans World Airlines told the same story with a different name on the tail. Under Howard Hughes, TWA competed directly with Pan Am for the same wealthy formal clientele, chasing the same reputation for polish across every route it flew. Two airlines, two logos, the same unspoken agreement with every passenger who walked through their doors. Dress like this matters because it genuinely does. Step inside a coach cabin in 1962, and the first thing you would notice is the silverware, real metal forks, china plates, or something close to it. A hot, multi-course meal served on a tray table by a stewardess in heels in a cabin full of men in ties and women in gloves. Coach class, the cheap seats of the day, looked like a supper club. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and airline meal service is one of the strangest corners of it. Some long routes offered carved meats at your seat. Cocktails came standard on many carriers, poured without a second thought. Smoking sections filled the cabin with a haze that would horrify a modern flyer, but at the time it was simply how a public room looked. None of this was written into federal law. There was no statute requiring a man to wear a tie onto an airplane. What existed instead was something harder to legislate and far more powerful, a shared, unspoken understanding of what a person wore in public. The airport did not invent the dress code. It simply inherited it from everywhere else formal life already happened. A man boarding a flight in 1961 dressed the same way he would walk into his office or into church on a Sunday morning. Suit, tie, often a hat, since hats had not yet fully vanished from a well-dressed man's daily wardrobe. He was not costuming himself for an airplane. He was simply being himself in public, and the airplane happened to be where he was going. It is tempting to think dressing up was only a woman's burden, another rule laid on her shoulders while men got to relax. That is not what the record shows. A man without a tie at a gate in this era stood out just as sharply as a woman without gloves. The formality ran both directions because it was never really about gender. It was about who belonged in that room. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down. Formal dress was practical then, not merely decorative. Cabins were louder, colder, and rougher, and a structured suit or a well-tailored dress with a coat handled turbulence and drafts better than anything soft ever could. What looks like pure elegance in old photographs was also, quietly, function dressed up as beauty. The stewardess herself deserves a closer look because her glamour came at a price the passengers rarely saw. Many airlines required her to be unmarried, to meet strict height and weight limits, and to retire from the job by her early 30s or the moment she got married, whichever came first. The uniform that looked so effortless in a magazine photo was built on rules no man in that cabin ever had to follow. By the early 1970s, one airline had leaned so hard into the glamour angle that its own advertising crossed into something closer to spectacle than service, selling the stewardess as much as the seat. It is worth saying plainly, the golden age was not innocent the way a nostalgic photograph makes it look. The elegance was real. So was the exploitation sitting underneath it. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, and that phrase belongs here as much as anywhere in this series. A woman who understood how to hold herself at a gate, how to sit in a cabin, how to accept a meal service with quiet grace, was not performing weakness. She was demonstrating a kind of control that modern travel rarely asks of anyone anymore. Picture the terminal at Idlewild in New York on a weekday afternoon in 1961. Marble floors, a newsstand selling papers folded under a man's arm, departure boards clicking over one letter at a time. Everyone in that room, whether departing or simply seeing someone off, wore their good clothes because the terminal itself functioned like a semi-public stage and no one wanted to be caught underdressed on it. Seeing someone off was its own ceremony, one almost nobody remembers now because it vanished along with the dress code. Family members would walk right up to the gate, sometimes onto the tarmac itself, to wave a departing traveler up the boarding stairs. It was goodbye performed in public, and public goodbyes, like everything else at the airport, called for a person's best clothes. Weight limits, girdles, hat pins, gloves fitted to the wrist. The stewardess uniform was engineered down to the smallest detail, and several major airlines brought in well-known fashion designers over the years to make sure of it. The point was never comfort. The point was an image so polished that a passenger felt elevated simply by being served by her. First class on the longest routes pushed the theater even further. Some carriers offered upper-deck lounges, piano bars, and multi-course dinners plated tableside, a level of ceremony that made a 6 or 8 hour flight feel closer to an evening at a private club than a mode of transportation. That upper-deck lounge is one of the clearest images of just how far the formality could go. Good manners, remember, even when we forget, and nowhere is that clearer than in how children were dressed for a flight. A little boy in a clip-on tie, a little girl in patent leather shoes and a coat that matched her mother's. Parents did not dress their children up because a child needed to look sophisticated. They did it because the whole family understood the room they were about to enter. Compare that scene to a boarding gate today, and the contrast writes itself without a single word of commentary needed. Sweatpants, slides, a neck pillow worn like a badge of honor before the flight has even begun. Nobody is wrong to dress for comfort on a 5-hour flight in a middle seat, but something did shift, and it is worth naming exactly what changed and why. If price was the gatekeeper holding the dress code up, then the moment that gate opened is the moment everything you see in a modern airport was set in motion. Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act in 1978, and within a few short years, the entire economic structure of American flying was rebuilt from the ground up. This is the single date that explains almost everything that follows. Before 1978, a federal board called the Civil Aeronautics Board set airline fares directly. Airlines could not simply lower a ticket price to win more customers, so instead they competed on service, on comfort, on glamour. Deregulation took that lever away and handed airlines a new one: price. Once price became the battlefield, comfort and formality were the first casualties. Within a handful of years, new low-cost carriers entered the market with fares that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, and older airlines had no choice but to answer them. Ticket prices that had held roughly steady for 20 years began falling, route by route, year by year, and the customer base that walked through the terminal doors started to look completely different. Here is the quiet mechanism most people never think about. When flying was expensive, everyone on board had already self-selected into a formal public-facing life. When flying became cheap, everyone got to come, which was a genuine good for the country, but it also meant the cabin was no longer full exclusively of people already dressed for a boardroom. The dress code did not get abolished, it simply lost its built-in audience. There is no villain in this story, and that matters because it would be easy to tell it as a tale of decline caused by carelessness. It was not carelessness. It was economics working exactly as intended, opening a door that had been shut to most Americans for half a century. The trade was real, wider access on one side of the scale, formality on the other. Airlines also began packing more seats into the same fuselage as fares fell. A decision with a direct physical consequence any modern flyer can feel in their knees on a long flight. Legroom that a coach passenger enjoyed in 1965 is simply gone from most economy cabins today, replaced by extra rows chasing the same price war that ended the dress code in the first place. The two stories share one root cause. Smoking sections lasted well into the late 1980s and, on a handful of routes, into the early 1990s before finally disappearing from American cabins entirely. That detail alone tells you how gradual this whole transformation actually was. The dress code did not vanish the day deregulation passed. It faded across 2 full decades, one small habit at a time, until nobody could name the exact year it finally disappeared for good. Meanwhile, a much bigger cultural current was moving underneath the airline industry the whole time, one that had nothing to do with ticket prices at all. American public dress, in general, was casualizing across every setting, from the office to the church pew to the dinner table. The airport did not casualize in isolation. It simply followed the same slow current everything else in daily life was already following. By the 1990s, Casual Friday had spread through American offices, khakis and polo shirts replacing suits one day a week, and then, gradually, most days. That same relaxation reached the airport gate at almost exactly the same pace. A man who no longer wore a tie to his own office had little reason left to put one on for a flight to visit his mother. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and the airplane meal is a perfect small monument to it. China plates became plastic trays, carved roast became a foil-wrapped sandwich, then a bag of pretzels. Then, on many routes, nothing at all unless you paid extra. Each downgrade felt small in the moment. Stacked across 3 decades, they add up to an entirely different experience of flight. Southwest Airlines deserves real credit here, whatever you think of its casual culture, because it proved a low-cost model could work at national scale through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Its success pulled the rest of the industry further toward affordability and further away from the formal, full-service model Pan Am and TWA had built their reputations on. Cheap and plentiful beat elegant and scarce, decisively. Pan Am itself did not survive to see the century turn. The airline that had defined glamorous flight for 2 generations ceased operations in December of 1991, undone by a combination of the fare wars it helped provoke, rising fuel costs, and a security disaster the year before that no amount of style could recover from. The name that meant elegance in the air quietly disappeared from the sky. TWA followed a similar arc, struggling through the 1990s under debt and competition before finally being absorbed by American Airlines in 2001. The two names that once stood for everything glamorous about flying, Pan Am and TWA, both vanished within a decade of each other. Their disappearance is not a footnote. It is the closing chapter of the story this entire video has been telling. So where does that leave the story now, decades later, with sweatpants as the unspoken uniform of modern travel? It leaves us with photographs, boxes of them in attics, in family albums, in the corners of estate sales, showing grandparents standing at a gate looking like they were headed somewhere important, because in a very real sense, for that one afternoon, they truly were. Every few years, one of those old photographs resurfaces online, a well-dressed family on a boarding staircase, a stewardess in white gloves pouring coffee, and it spreads far beyond anyone who set out to make it viral. People are not just admiring the outfits. They are recognizing, often without quite naming it, that something about how we treated a shared public space has genuinely changed, and not entirely for the better. A few airlines have even tried to borrow that old magic back on purpose. Retro-inspired uniforms, throwback liveries painted onto modern jets, marketing campaigns that lean hard into a Pan Am aesthetic without ever quite admitting they cannot recreate the economics that made the original possible. You cannot manufacture scarcity retroactively. You can only imitate its look, never its meaning. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. And here is where that truth becomes something a viewer can actually use rather than just admire. You do not need a $300 ticket to dress like your arrival matters. The habit was never really about the airplane. It was about believing the room you walked into deserved your best effort, and that belief travels for free. Consider what dressing for the gate actually communicated, beyond fabric and cut. It told a stranger sitting 3 feet away, someone you would never meet again, that you respected the shared space enough to show up prepared for it. That message has nothing to do with wealth in principle, even if wealth was what made it affordable in practice back then. The respect itself cost nothing. Compare that quietly without judgment to how a shared public space functions today, whether it is a plane, a movie theater, or a grocery store checkout line. Comfort has become the only value most people optimize for in public, and comfort is not a bad value on its own. It's simply used to sit beside another value, presentation for others, that has almost entirely fallen away. None of this means returning to gloves and pillbox hats at the security line, which would be its own kind of costume rather than a genuine revival. What it means is smaller and far more achievable. A pressed shirt instead of the first thing pulled from the drawer, shoes instead of slides, a small deliberate signal that this trip, this room, this stranger sitting beside you still deserves a version of your effort. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and it was never really about hats and gloves at all. It was the underlying idea that how you present yourself is a form of consideration for the people around you, not merely an expression of how you personally feel that day. That idea does not require an airplane. It only requires remembering that other people are in the room with you. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and this video has tried to hand a small piece of it back. Not the ticket price, not the girdle, not the smoking section nobody misses. Just the underlying instinct, that showing up for a shared moment, dressed like it matters, was never really about the airplane at all. It was about you and everyone else in that room with you. If this kind of forgotten rule speaks to you, there are dozens more waiting in the rest of this channel, from the calling card left on a silver tray to the exact way a lady entered a room she had never been in before. Subscribe if you want more of these small, vanished codes brought back into the light, one gate, one table, one doorway at a time. Good manners, remember, even when we forget. Return for a moment to the woman we opened with, standing at the gate in her gloves and her small hat, checking her seams one last time before her name was called. She was not performing for the camera that never came. She was simply living inside a code so complete it never needed to be written down, one that told her exactly who to be the moment she stepped through those terminal doors. That code cost her nothing extra to follow. It was simply how a person of her era understood the world, a set of rules absorbed so early and so completely that following them felt less like effort and more like breathing. We tend to imagine discipline as something exhausting. For her generation, this particular discipline was closer to instinct, learned in childhood and never once questioned. Think, too, about how much preparation a single trip required before the packing even began. A suit pressed the night before, shoes polished, a hat steamed back into shape. All of it invisible labor that made the eventual gate appearance look effortless, the same way a stage performance looks effortless only because of everything that happened backstage first, unseen and unremarked upon. It is worth pausing on the men's side of this story a little longer, because their formality gets less attention than the stewardess uniforms and the hats, yet it was every bit as rigid. A businessman flying for a Monday meeting packed a second suit for the return trip, shined his shoes at the hotel the night before, and treated the flight itself as an extension of the workday rather than a break from it. That blending of work life and travel life mattered more than it might seem, because it meant the airport was never a separate, relaxed zone the way it can feel today. It was simply another extension of professional and social life, governed by the exact same standards a person carried everywhere else. There was no code switching into comfort mode. The standard followed you through every door. Consider, too, how the airlines themselves reinforced all of this through their advertising, which almost never showed a plane in isolation. The ads showed a woman in a cocktail dress being handed a drink by a stewardess, a family arriving somewhere exotic, already dressed for the occasion, waiting on the other end. The product being sold was never really transportation. It was a lifestyle, and lifestyles come with a wardrobe attached. That marketing worked because it was aspirational in a way that felt achievable to the people who could already afford a ticket. You were not being sold a fantasy entirely out of reach. You were being sold the confirmation of a life you already believed you were living, dressed exactly the way that life required. The airline just handed you the stage to prove it. It is easy, looking back, to romanticize every part of this without asking who was left out of the picture entirely. The vast majority of Americans in 1960, including most working families, most people of color facing separate and often harsher barriers in public accommodations of every kind, and most people simply too poor for a plane ticket, never appeared in any of these glamorous photographs at all. The golden age had a narrow gate. That narrow gate matters for honesty, not to diminish the elegance, but to place it correctly. This was never a universal American experience being described. It was the visible tip of a much larger country, most of which traveled by car, by bus, by train, dressed for those trips in their own way, with their own version of the same underlying respect for public appearance, just without a jet involved. The train station, in fact, deserves its own mention here because it followed nearly identical rules years before the airport ever existed as a mass destination. Pullman porters in crisp uniforms, dining cars with white tablecloths, passengers dressed for a journey the same way they would dress for the airplane a decade later. The airport did not invent this formality. It simply inherited a ceremony America had already perfected on the rails. That continuity matters because it reframes the whole question this video set out to answer. It was never really, at its core, a question about airplanes specifically. It was a question about how an entire generation understood public space, full stop, and the airplane simply happened to be the newest, most modern stage that generations' existing standards got applied to. Notice, too, how quickly a norm this deep can still be forgotten once its economic foundation disappears. 2 decades. That is roughly how long it took for coat and tie to go from unquestioned expectation to genuine rarity at an American gate, once deregulation removed the price floor, holding the old audience in place. Culture, it turns out, is far more fragile than most of us assume while we are living inside it. That fragility should give any viewer pause, and not only about airplanes. Whatever rules feel permanent and obvious in your own daily life right now are very likely resting on some quieter economic or technological foundation you have not fully examined, one that could shift the way deregulation shifted flying and take the whole unspoken code down with it inside a single generation. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, and there is a version of that lesson worth carrying past this particular story. Old rules do not become worthless the moment their original context vanishes. They often become more valuable, precisely because almost nobody is bothering to practice them anymore, and scarcity has a way of turning a habit back into something distinctive. Picture a woman today who simply chooses to dress with a little more care for her flight, not out of nostalgia performance, but out of genuine preference. She notices something almost immediately: a gate agent who makes eye contact a beat longer, a seatmate who strikes up a slightly warmer conversation. Small data points, easy to dismiss individually, that quietly confirm the old instinct was never actually wrong. None of this is a call to judge the person beside you in sweatpants on a red-eye flight, exhausted after a long week, doing exactly what makes sense for their own body and their own trip. The point was never judgment of others. It was always self-respect, quietly practiced, regardless of whether anyone else in the cabin happens to be practicing it alongside you that day. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and part of what makes it worth excavating is how much of it survives in objects rather than words. An old hat box in a closet, a pair of white gloves folded in a drawer nobody has opened in years. Physical evidence of a standard the culture stopped teaching out loud, but never entirely erased from the households where it once lived. If your own mother or grandmother ever told you a story about a trip she took by air in those years, that story almost certainly included what she wore, described in more precise detail than she described the destination itself. That detail was not vanity. It was memory doing exactly what memory does, preserving the parts of an experience that felt most significant to the person living it. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and perhaps the clearest version of it is simply this: dressing well for a shared public moment was never about vanity at all. It was a form of quiet generosity, extended toward strangers she would likely never see again, asking nothing back except the same small courtesy in return, offered without ever being asked. Somewhere between the pressed suit of 1962 and the sweatpants of today, American public life traded formality for accessibility, and on balance, that trade was probably worth making. More people got to fly. More families got to see each other across long distances they could never have afforded to cross before. That expansion deserves genuine credit, even from a channel built on mourning what came with it. What this channel asks is not a return to the old economics, which nobody genuinely wants back, girdles and all. What it asks is a return to the underlying instinct, stripped of its price tag and its exclusions, available now to absolutely anyone regardless of what their ticket cost. That instinct was never actually about money in the first place. Money simply happened to be the gate it walked through first. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, and if you take nothing else from this video, take this. The next time you catch yourself reaching for the most comfortable thing in the closet before heading out the door to somewhere that actually matters to you, pause for one extra moment. Ask what a slightly more deliberate version of that same outfit might say to the room you are about to enter. That pause, that single extra moment of consideration, is really the whole inheritance this video has been trying to hand back to you. Not the gloves, not the hat pins, not the $300 ticket that put those things out of reach for most of the country in the first place. Just the pause and the respect for a shared room that the pause represents. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. And this channel exists to keep finding pieces of it, one forgotten rule at a time, so that the women and men who lived by these codes without ever writing them down do not simply vanish from memory the way the coat and tie vanished from the airport gate. Somewhere in a box in someone's attic right now, there is likely a photograph, just like the one that opened this video. A relative in gloves and a small hat, standing at a gate that no longer exists in that form, waiting to board a plane that has long since been retired to a scrapyard in the desert. That photograph is not a relic. It is an instruction, quietly waiting for someone to read it again. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it, and that is really the truest sentence in this whole story. Nobody handed her a manual at the ticket counter. She simply knew, the way an entire generation simply knew 100 small rules like it, and carried them so quietly that most of us never noticed they were rules at all until they were already gone. If this brought back a memory of your own, or your mother's, or a photograph you have never quite known what to do with, tell me about it in the comments below. And if you want more of these forgotten rules brought back into the light, subscribe to Clara's Forgotten Manners, because good manners remember, even when we forget. I will see you in the next one.